This is the second of two C1 Media screencasts looking at audience effects theories. And in this screencast we're going to look at two additional theories. We're going to look at the uses and gratifications model and also the decoding model. And both of the perspectives that we're going to look at in this screencast really challenge the view that is implied in this particular cartoon. So both perspectives really want to challenge the idea that audiences are passively spoon-fed information from the mass media. So in the uses and gratifications model proposed by Blumler and McQuail, media audiences are active and use the media in various ways for their own various pleasures and interests, or to use the jargon, for their own gratifications. So compared to the theories that we discussed in the first screencast, the emphasis changes from the various ways that the media influence and manipulate people to an emphasis on the way in which audiences actively use the media. As we can see from this quote, uses and gratifications model means that we've got to get away from the habit of thinking in terms of what the media do to people and substitute it for the idea of what people do with the media. For example, Blumler and McQuail identify four basic needs which people use the media in order to satisfy. So firstly, we've got diversion. So people will sometimes use the media as a form of escape or release. Secondly, we've got personal relationships. So people will form attachments to TV characters or personalities. Thirdly, we've got personal identity. So this is where people will use the media to compare their lives with the characters and situations on TV to explore their own personal problems and issues. And then fourthly, we've got surveillance, which is where the media is used as a way of gathering information about what's going on in the world. So the uses and gratifications model recognizes the active role of media audiences. It recognizes that audiences make very conscious choices about how they use the media, and it's the job of media companies, therefore, to provide a range of content to satisfy these audience needs. And I think in this sense, this model can be linked to the pluralist view of the mass media, this idea that the media is basically responding to what the audience wants. However, this particular perspective would be criticised by Marxist sociologists. So Marxists would argue that this type of model overestimates the power of the audience to influence media content, and it also underestimates the power and influence of the media and media companies to shape and influence the choices that people make and the pleasures that they derive from the media. So media companies set the choices, and the media may create false needs for media consumers through devices like advertising. The final model that we're going to look at in this particular topic is the decoding model. So this is another perspective which emphasises the active role of audiences, and it's particularly associated with the work of Stuart Hall. And according to this perspective, media texts such as stories in newspapers or programmes on television are encoded by those who produce them. And what this means is that they contain a particular meaning or ideology which they expect audiences to believe. However, according to this perspective, different audiences respond to media texts in different ways. So they receive the meaning or decode the meaning of media texts in a variety of different ways. And the different ways in which the audience decode the meaning of media texts are referred to as readings. And according to this particular model, there are three main ways in which people read or interpret media text. There's the dominant reading, the negotiated reading, and an oppositional reading. So a dominant reading is one where audiences read or decode and interpret media messages in the way that those producing the media content actually intended. A negotiated reading is perhaps the most common reading of a media text and describes the audience position of partly accepting the intended meaning of a media message but partly rejecting it. Whereas an oppositional reading of a media text is where an audience member completely rejects the intended meaning of the media message. So the key idea here is that media texts are polysemic, and this simply means that they don't have a fixed meaning, that they are things that can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. One of the examples that I want to have a look at in class is this particular media text, which is an article that appeared in the Daily Telegraph newspaper a few years ago after there had been violence during a demonstration and march organised by the trade union movement to protest against government cuts. And what I'd like you to have a think about before you come to class is how we can apply the decoding model to this particular story. So for example, what might be a dominant reading of this particular text? What do you think is the intended meaning of this particular story? What might be a negotiated reading of this particular text? And finally, what might be an oppositional reading of this particular story? Now, as David Morley has argued, the way in which people interpret media texts may be dependent on a range of social and cultural factors. So it might be related to their education, their upbringing within the family, the social groups that they belong to, their religion, their ethnicity, and so on. In other words, to understand how audiences interpret the media, we need to also look at the social and cultural backgrounds of different sections of the audience. One of the ways in which audiences actively decode the media is through a process called selective filtering. And this is something that Clapper argues. Clapper argues that we filter what we read, see or hear in the media by selective exposure, selective perception, and selective retention. So selective exposure means that people only watch or read media output that fits in with their existing views and interests. Selective perception means that people will filter and interpret media output so that they only see or hear that which fits in with their own pre-existing views and interests. And then selective retention means that people will ignore or forget media output that is not in line with their own views and interests. However, although this model suggests that audiences can have some control over their response to media output through selective filtering, the cultural effects model, I think, would argue that long-term socialization by the media through repetitive messages may limit the ability of audiences to filter those messages.